As always, thanks for having me. We have such a good time coming and doing these quick little workshops. So today we're going to talk about the science of parenting on parenting preschoolers. All of the questions, right? Why? Are we there yet? All of the wonderful and challenging things that come with raising a preschooler. So we are the Science of Parenting team. I have my colleague Barb Dunn Swanson here with me today, kind of hanging out. You're going to see her in our sessions in July and probably August as well. But we are both a part of Iowa State University Extension Outreach. We're part of the university. We say we're the 99 county campus. There's an extension office in every county working to bring research out to the field and everybody across Iowa. In particular, we're a part of Human Sciences Extension. Our specialty happens to be in family life. I'm one of the team members on our Science of Parenting team. We do have a podcast, which we will reference, a time or two here throughout our session today. But yes, I'm a certified family life educator. I have my graduate degree is in adult learning, but focused in family life education, particularly in parenting education. So this is really my sweet spot and my passion to talk with y'all. I have a toddler and a preschooler myself. Actually, my daughter turns 5 this summer, so I'm gonna have to get ready to say she's moving into the next kind of school age category. A few things about what we believe about parenting. We think that there's more than one way to raise great kids. Everybody's got their own situation and their own supports and things, but we know there's more than one way. We think that you as a parent are the expert on your family and on your kids. So we work to share research-based information. You get to decide what's best for your reality. We work hard to make our information available when you need it most, making it searchable online, having blogs, having our podcasts, our videos that you can access, our audio you can access so that you can find it when you need it. And we also encourage families, right? Information is one step, and sometimes the parent-child relationship could use more support. And so we would encourage you to find those professionals locally. So a little bit about how we're going to frame our conversation today. We're going to talk about some of the developmental tasks that preschoolers go through across these domains. So the domains are just a basic way that we break up understanding kind of the ages and stages that our kids go through, kind of the categories that lump together the different skills that they have. But before we get into those specific of those developmental tasks, I want to remind everybody, if you were in Lori's session on parenting teens, you probably heard her say this too, but that we know all kids develop at their own rate. It's dependent on their environment, their temperament, all kinds of things around them and in them that affect their development. And so we really discourage comparison when it comes to development, which we know can be hard in our parenting and with our kids, but that each kid has their own journey through development. And so as we think about development in these preschool years, I do want to ask you in the chat, if you'll pop in the chat, what brought you here for this particular session? Are you a parent of a preschooler? Do you serve parents of preschoolers? Do you just have to come to every single Science of Parenting session? Because I would not be offended by that either. But what brought you here? What about this topic of parenting preschoolers got you kind of in the door today for our session? So while that's typing in the chat, I'll give a little refresher that I know I've said in previous sessions, but basically just the idea that across all ages, but including the preschool years, that kids benefit from parents having an understanding of their child's development. So when we gain understanding of developmental milestones, we know that as parents, we're more likely to have appropriate expectations of our kids, which hey, big bonus, reduces frustration for both of us. So we can have appropriate expectations of our kids. We have higher quality interactions with them, right? The interactions we have build their skills in meaningful ways, and the strategies that we use with our kids are more effective. So we have, an honorary not grant. Well, that's kind of a good word too. I kind of make me into that. Honorary aunt and grandmother, just some curiosity. A foster parent, awesome, Rachel. I love that. My mom's a foster parent too, so that's a sweet spot in my heart. I have lots of foster siblings. So yes, looking at the preschool years, what are kind of the tools and techniques? We always focus in on that. What does research tell us about parenting preschoolers? And then how do we really bring those, or Barb used the word operationalize today. And I'm like, oh, I need to say that word more. How do we put that into practice in our own reality? And so a few tools and techniques related to understanding development. We talk about identifying developmental tasks. So what are our kids working on? What are they building? What's going on in their brain and in their world? Second, we know that not every preschooler is the same. We did a bonus episode related to children with special needs, but even typically developing children, right, develop at their own rate and have their own quirks. A big part of that is their temperament. So we can individualize our parenting, right? We might know that even two kids in the same family need different parenting strategies from us. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can individualize. And then we have a tip for how we can interact with those preschoolers in meaningful ways. So we're going to start by looking at identifying developmental tasks. So I'm going to break this down by the domains. So some of these might feel pretty obvious to you, and some might be less obvious to you. So as we think about preschoolers and their physical development, we know, right, our infants were crawling, our toddlers were walking, right? What are our preschoolers doing? Well, they're getting a lot better at mastering their gross motor skills, right? So instead of just being able to run, now they can maybe hopscotch, right? My daughter, it was a big conversation in our house when my daughter learned to gallop instead of skip, right? And so some of those more specific gross motor skills, things like balance, things like climbing, they're able to use their body in new ways and to explore, different kinds of activities because of it, right? We see more soccer practice, we see more basketball, dance, basketball, maybe not so much preschool, but some dance. Oh, Barb, am I supposed to call on you?
And how about the time that my sister went to preschool roundup and they noticed, your son doesn't jump. You need to go home jumping with him. He doesn't jump. So, you learn some things.
Yes, and so there are these gross motor skills that they're really working on mastering, those more kind of specific gross motor skills, but also fine motor skills, which are actually really important for them eventually learning to write. And at the preschool age, we know they do some scribbling, they start to do some letter-like forms, which is also part of their language development. But things like scissor skills and gluing and pasting, a lot of those skills, they may seem like, oh, how big of a deal is it if for this or that? But actually, it's a really important part of writing to learn to master some of that fine motor skills. So encouraging that is a great thing for your preschoolers. In terms of their cognitive development, cognitive is really related to kind of their thinking brain, if you will. Something that is typical for preschoolers is they're really exploring roles in the world. So we see a lot of pretend play, right? Some of the dress up, some of the kitchen set, and some kids are more into it than others, right? But a big part of why this is developmentally appropriate for our preschoolers is so they can kind of like try on those roles, right? So we have gender roles in our society. We have jobs, we have leisure activities. And so kids get the chance to kind of test those things out and practice those kinds of skills and, regurgitate whatever they've seen some other adults, whether in media or in their life, they get to practice those things. So pretend play is a big part of their cognitive development. And then the other thing I like to remind parents of preschoolers or grants, right, aunts and grandmothers, is that they're still pretty egocentric. So they're still pretty self-focused. They're not great at perspective taking yet. So things like sharing are still coming around. Things like impulse control really isn't well developed until the later fours. And so understanding those things, right, helps us have those appropriate expectations. When it comes to language, one of my favorite things to observe in a preschooler is that they can start to use persuasion, right? So like my daughter, we had a big like town festival a couple weeks ago, and my daughter she wants to convince me that she needs some of the candy when she gets home, right? But that power of persuasion, because they understand how language works to communicate, they're also getting a better sense of like the grammar and structure of the language that they speak, whichever, right? If they're bilingual, if they speak English or a different language at this age is where they get a much better sense of that. And of course, a bigger vocabulary. So, and then another huge thing that they're working on when it comes to language is those very kind of primary skills of learning to read and write, right? They're recognizing letters, starting to know some letter sounds, doing some letter-like symbols, right? Older preschoolers doing things like writing names, sometimes even learning to read in the formal sense. But those are all things that we can encourage with our preschoolers because that's an important part of their development right now. Next is emotional development. And like, oof, emotionally and social, those are biggies in preschool. In terms of their emotional development, preschoolers are really figuring out their self-concept, right? Who am I? Where do I fit in the world? Their brain is really trying to lump, right? That's a part of understanding those roles. So lumping like I am smart or I'm not smart. I like arts and crafts, or I like this other thing, right? They're putting people and including themselves in groups to try to understand the world a little bit better. And so that self-concept, it's a great time to encourage them to explore a wide variety of things. So like I have a slow to warm up kid who needs a little bit of push to explore new things, while I maybe was a kid that needed a little bit of pull in the reins. You can't try all the things. So we know each kid is different, but that self-concept and trying a wide variety of activities is really great for their emotional development. We also see a lot of fear at this age. And a really cool thing about the preschool brain is that it cannot differentiate well between reality and fantasy. So reading a book that has even a mildly scary figure in it, it's hard for them to differentiate. Is that real or is that pretend, right? Seeing something in a TV show, it's also hard for kids to understand, preschoolers to understand the idea of like superhero movies of like vigilante justice, right? Like it's okay for this person to be violent because it's for good, right? They don't have that advanced thinking yet to differentiate. Like they say, well, punching people good, punching people bad, which one? And so that can be a really confusing thing because their brain does not yet differentiate well. And so things like nightmares, things like, movies and TV characters can feel scary because it's hard. So one thing that we can do to practice and address that is to have conversations around, even in my house this week, it was unicorns. We talk, are unicorns real or not real? But knowing that my child doesn't always have doesn't always have a realistic perspective on fantasy versus reality, it's something we can address with our preschoolers to help reduce some of that fear they might experience, help them understand which things are real and which things are fantasy. And then I mentioned a little earlier that self-regulation and that impulse control. It's coming around way better in our preschoolers than it was in our toddlers, but they're not quite there yet in terms of consistency. Sometimes it'll seem like they really have it together, and other times it might seem like they're falling apart. So it's not really a well-developed skill in terms of emotion regulation, right? That like I feel mad and I can behave appropriately when I feel mad. They're still developing that, as well as, well, I want this thing so I can just do it, right? That impulse control of like, wait, I should process there might be a consequence to that behavior. All right, and then finally for their social development, one, we tend to see, again, as a part of kind of lumping people into groups, we tend to see that our preschoolers tend to prefer to play in similar gendered groups. That's a very like normal thing for preschoolers, that the boys tend to play with boys or girls tend to play with girls. But also we see that as toddlers, they did what we call parallel play. Like toddlers might play by side, but they're not really involved together. Our preschoolers are starting to do more cooperating. They're doing more shared activities. They might each have a role, like I'll be the mom and you be the dog, right? And so they have that sense of cooperating and playing together in those developmental domains. So I do want to ask, thinking about these developmental domains, if there is a preschooler in your life, is there a certain area you feel like your child is particularly working on right now that you're seeing, right? Like, holy cow, in my house, we're having tons of conversations around real or not real, right? Like, okay, so Maleficent actually is one we've been talking about. And it's like, okay, that's a pretend character. That's not a real person. They don't really have that superpower, right? And so, but we have like navigate that to help reduce some fear around things. So I'd love to see which area, because we do see a cool thing about development. We think about physical growth spurts, right? Like if you have older kids, you've seen them go from one size to the next, sometimes in a matter of a few months. which is painful on our budget. But we see that in other developmental domains too, right? They can have a huge growth spurt in their emotional development. They can have a growth spurt, right? We call it language explosion with toddlers. And so you can see how that shifts over time. So I'd love to see if you've got a certain developmental domain you really see the preschooler in your life kind of going through and working on. A few more things about developmental tasks related to preschool. On our Science of Parenting website, I love this guy's little picture, but you can go to our Science of Parenting website and find a lot more information. Of course, today in our little 30-minute session, we could only touch into so much, but you can find more on our website. And a reason that we work so hard to put this developmental information in your hands so you can access it whenever, we know that you can only take in so much developmental information at a time, right? When it comes to understanding a preschooler's development, okay, that's great. In a year, like I said, my daughter's 25. Okay, then I'm gonna need to start thinking about school age development. But I know I'm not ready to take all of that in yet, right? If you tell me cool things about teens that I need to know, I'm like, hey, I don't need that, I need this. I need preschool stuff and I need it now. So we really like to make sure that we give you the opportunity to go find the things whenever your teachable moment is. So our Science of Parenting website is one. In the Iowa State Extension store, we have, well, we call it the store, but really you can download a lot of our free publications there. Our Human Sciences website has a whole host of educational programs and resources that you can tap into. And particularly, we love our Ages and Stages newsletter. It's like a front and back page that outlines, again, more specifically, some of the tasks your preschooler is working on, as well as some really great activities and interactions that you can have with them. So our first step when it comes to development is to start to identify, to understand the tasks that are going on with our preschooler. Our second is, how do we individualize our parenting to this specific preschooler, right? A big part of that is temperament. Now, if you've been in one of our sessions before on temperament, or maybe you heard our season 3, which is all about temperament, there's so much really fascinating science behind it. It's a little different than personality, but it's really about the patterns of reactions of behavior over time. That all of us get all 9 traits. It's just a matter of how much did you get. So one of the traits is intensity. Are you more like me, or is your child more like me? That's like, it's loud, it's big feelings, you always know where they're at. Or my husband tends to be much more mild, where he's basically always about here. Sometimes we get a little crazy and he bounces up a little bit, but that's his version of intensity. And so everybody gets all 9 of these traits, including our kids. And they're inborn, they're genetic traits. We're not going to change their temperament. We can help them learn skills to adapt to the world with their temperament, to create what we call a goodness of fit. And so, you know, when it comes to the emotional development of my daughter, who's going to be 5, who's a preschooler, she's intense like I am. And so I really need to teach her appropriate ways to express those big feelings, right? Those are things that we really need to work on, versus with a much more mild intensity child. It might be about helping them learn, like, you can say, I feel mad, or you can say, I don't like when you do that, or you can say, right? And it's more about teaching them you can express yourself, versus an intense child we might need to teach, like, this is how you can appropriately express yourself. And so we know that temperament is a big part of how we can individualize our parenting to our kids. I also shared earlier that I have a slow to warm up kiddo. And so she sometimes needs a little nudge, right, into the world. Like, okay, I'm going to help you do this. We can go out and we can try new things together. Doing things for the first time tends to be hard for low approach kids. So you have a kid that tends to be like, needs some time to soak stuff in. Maybe they're teary when you drop them off for the first time somewhere, versus you got a kid that is like ready to talk to all the strangers and jumps out of the car before you've unbuckled, right? That high approach kid, they need a different set of skills, right? As parents, we need to teach them about safety and about strangers and yes, those are things we teach all of our kids, but understanding how we can individualize those skills, knowing what a preschooler is typically doing developmentally, and understanding that our child's specific temperament to help understand what they need from us. And then finally, we got to work with Dr. Lang, who is a professor in the Human Development Department. She gave us her open access online book that we got to tap into during our whole season 5 on ages and stages. And she has these really great one-liners. So this is what she says about how we can parent preschoolers, how we can interact with them. And she's like, if I had to say it in 20 words or less, right? And so she says that we can utilize creative and individualized strategies to guide children's desirable behavior patterns to become their typical interactions. So this really, again, individualized, thinking about my specific kid and what they specifically need from me. And we're helping to teach them, they're learning so much about social norms, right? About the roles people play in the world. We are helping them learn what our desired behaviors are, right? Is kicking and screaming when we're upset, right? For some parents, stomping your feet is like, that's an appropriate way to express yourself. And for some parents, it's like, whoo, hoo, hoo, do not stomp your foot at me, right? And so thinking about what those desired behaviors are, that you can teach them and try to be consistent in what you expect of your child so that they become the way they learn to interact with the world, right? The rules that they follow when they're at preschool, when they're at soccer practice, when they're at the dance, at these different kinds of activities. And so we are really working on our strategies to help them learn the desired behaviors so that as they become older, right, we know that our school age kids spend a lot more time out of the house than our preschoolers did. But as we transition them into becoming those kids that are going to spend more time in the neighborhood and at practice and all these other places, that they know kind of what the typical expected behavior is of them. So we're really helping kind of scaffold to that with our preschoolers. So that brings our 3 I's. We're able to identify those tasks that our preschoolers are working on across different domains. And I'll say, and I'm just kind of pulling in here some of the chat that some are working on negotiating skills. That power of persuasion is really coming in. Oh, thanks, Barb, for answering that question. Yes, I didn't define. Our preschoolers are usually our 3 to 5 year olds that we're talking about. But yeah, so we get to identify the tasks, which help us know what to have for realistic expectations for them. We get to individualize for our unique child and their quirks and temperament and the way they interact with the world. And then we get to interact with them in a meaningful way, helping them understand the world around them and what we desire for behaviors in the world. So we do have a podcast episode specifically about preschoolers where we dive into this information in a little bit more depth. But we also have an episode for all ages. So we have one about the parenting stages. We did a webinar on that, but also have a podcast episode. And then infants, toddlers, preschoolers, school agers, preteens, teens, and even parenting young and emerging adults. So you can check out those on any podcast platform. They're totally free. You can also follow us on social media. We, in addition to our podcast content, Barb is also our fabulous blog writer. And we also put out content on social media that you can follow along with us. And if you've got specific questions, you can also email us at parenting@iastate.edu. So we love to connect with parents and help you find the research-based information that fits your family. So that is what I have